combat grit washed away faster than deep corruption, staining courtroom 4B. A heavy gavel slammed down, condemning a decorated Navy sniper as an unfit mother. Standing entirely silent, absorbing every vicious insult, Chloe simply waited for one perfect moment to drop a devastating classified codename and destroy a corrupt judge. Air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone in the Fulton County family court, a sound that desperately tried and failed to mask the tension suffocating the room. Sunlight cut through the heavy mahogany blinds, casting rigid, horizontal shadows across the polished defense table. At that table sat Chloe Henderson. She was absolutely motionless, her posture perfectly aligned, hands resting lightly on her lap. To the untrained eye, she looked defeated, a mother stripped of her fight. But Chloe wasn't defeated. She was on the scope. For 8 years, Chloe had served in the United States Navy. For 4 of those, she was attached to a Tier 1 Joint Task Force, an operator who broke glass ceilings by becoming one of the first female SEAL snipers to deploy in clandestine operations across the Middle East and North Africa. She knew how to slow her heart rate to 35 beats per minute. She knew how to lie in a freezing, mud-soaked trench for 72 hours without moving a muscle, waiting for a high-value target to step into the crosshairs. Compared to the Korengal Valley, courtroom 4B was a walk in the park, but the stakes here were infinitely higher. The target wasn't an insurgent leader. It was custody of her 6-year-old daughter, Lily. Seated across the aisle was her ex-husband, Richard Sterling. Richard was the heir to a lucrative real estate empire, a man who wore $5,000 Tom Ford suits and smiled with the practiced ease of a sociopath. When he wanted out of the marriage, he didn't just ask for a divorce. He promised to obliterate Chloe, to take Lily, and to leave her with nothing. To accomplish this, he had hired David Caldwell, a shark of an attorney known for his ruthless character assassinations. More importantly, Richard had pulled strings to ensure their case landed on the docket of the Honorable Judge Arthur Pendleton. Judge Pendleton was an institution in the city, a silver-haired, crimson-faced patrician who ruled his courtroom like a feudal lord. He had a reputation for favoring wealthy, connected fathers and possessing a deeply ingrained, patronizing view of women. Today, he was in rare form. "Mr. Caldwell," Pendleton's voice boomed from the elevated bench, his microphone clipping slightly. "Are you concluding your assessment of the mother's psychological fitness?" "I am, Your Honor," Caldwell said, slicking back his hair as he stood. He didn't look at Chloe, he played directly to the judge. "We have established that Ms. Henderson's extensive military background, particularly her time in whatever classified combat roles she claims to have participated in, has left her fundamentally unequipped for domestic life. Her medical records indicate treatment for sleep disturbances. She possesses a lethal skill set. She is, by her own admission, trained to kill. Is this the environment for a delicate 6-year-old girl?" "Objection," Chloe's lawyer, a tired public defender named Greg Miller, half-heartedly mumbled, rising halfway out of his chair. "Relevance, my client's service to her country." "Overruled, Mr. Miller," Pendleton snapped, banging his gavel once. "The court is highly concerned with the mother's stability." "Sit down." Greg sighed and sank back into his chair. Chloe didn't blink. She kept her eyes fixed on Pendleton. She was reading his micro-expressions, the slight flare of his nostrils, the way he leaned forward, eager to assert his dominance. He was enjoying this. He was a man who loved to break people who couldn't fight back. Pendleton adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at Chloe, a sneer curling the corner of his mouth. "Ms. Henderson, this court recognizes that you wore a uniform, but let us not romanticize the reality of your situation. You spent years in the dirt, surrounded by violence. You come back here and expect to seamlessly transition into the role of a nurturing mother?" Chloe remained silent, her face a mask of stone. "In sniper school, they teach you about windage and elevation. You don't fire when the wind is erratic. You wait for the lull." "You women go over there," Pendleton continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "trying to play in a man's arena, and you come back shattered. You are too weak to handle the rigors of a civilian home. Your mind is fractured by whatever you saw in the desert. The court views you not as a hero, Ms. Henderson, but as a liability. A broken, weak woman who is fundamentally unfit to raise a child in a civilized society." Richard let out a soft, audible scoff of amusement from the petitioner's table. Pendleton raised his gavel, preparing to deliver the final blow. "Based on the evidence presented, I am prepared to grant full, sole, legal, and physical custody of the minor child, Lily Sterling, to the father. The mother will be granted supervised visitation." "Your Honor," Chloe said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heavy air of the courtroom like a suppressed gunshot. It was calm, measured, and completely devoid of the hysteria Pendleton clearly expected. Pendleton froze, the gavel hovering an inch above the sound block. His face flushed a deeper shade of crimson. "Excuse me? You do not speak unless spoken to, Ms. Henderson. I am issuing my ruling." "I am requesting permission to approach the bench," Chloe said, slowly standing up. She smoothed the front of her modest grey blazer. "There is a final piece of evidence regarding the character and fitness of the parties involved that has not been submitted. Evidence that directly impacts the integrity of this ruling." "We object to any late submissions, Your Honor," Caldwell barked, suddenly looking nervous. "The evidentiary phase is closed." "Sustained," Pendleton growled. "Sit down, young lady, before I hold you in contempt." Chloe took a step out from behind the table. "I don't think you want to sustain that objection, Arthur." A collective gasp echoed through the gallery. Greg Miller buried his face in his hands. Dropping the honorific and addressing a judge by his first name in his own courtroom was procedural suicide. Pendleton's eyes widened in sheer outrage. "Bailiff! Take this woman into custody immediately. I find her in direct contempt of court." The bailiff, a heavy-set man in a sheriff's uniform, stepped forward, resting his hand on his utility belt. Chloe didn't look at the bailiff. She kept her dead-level gaze locked on the judge. She took one more step forward, leaning slightly over the wooden railing that separated the gallery from the well of the court. "Does the court remember the night of October 14th, 2018? Chloe asked, her voice dropping an octave, meant only for Pendleton to hear clearly. Pendleton hesitated, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. "What? What nonsense are you—" "Does the court remember a valley in Paktika province?" Chloe continued, the words rolling off her tongue with surgical precision. "Does the court remember the sound of a secure SAT phone ringing at 0300 hours? The color instantly drained from Judge Arthur Pendleton's face. The crimson flush vanished, replaced by an ashen, sickly grey. His hand, still gripping the gavel, began to tremble uncontrollably. To understand the sudden terror in Judge Pendleton's eyes, one had to rewind the clock by 3 weeks. When Richard first filed for sole custody, Chloe knew the deck was stacked. Richard had money, and he had connections. But Chloe had a different kind of network. When you bleed with people, when you pull them out of burning Humvees and cover their exfil under heavy enemy fire, you forge bonds that money can't buy. 2 weeks before the trial, Chloe sat in a dimly lit diner on the outskirts of Atlanta with Brody Finley. Everyone in the teams called him Huck. Huck wasn't a door kicker. He was a signals intelligence wizard for the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC. If it had a microchip and transmitted a signal, Huck could see it. "You're asking me to pull a federal judge's background, Chloe," Huck had said, nursing a black coffee. He looked around the empty diner nervously. "If they catch me dipping into the NSA databases for a domestic custody dispute, I'll be making license plates at Leavenworth." "I don't need his tax returns, Huck," Chloe had replied, sliding a manila envelope across the Formica table. "I need to know why Richard Sterling is so confident. Richard's father is heavily invested in defense contracting. Judge Pendleton spent 10 years in Washington as a legal liaison for the Department of Defense before taking the bench. I need to know where those two circles overlap." Huck had sighed, taking the envelope. "Give me 48 hours." He had called her back in 12. When Chloe arrived at Huck's secure apartment, he looked like he had seen a ghost. His multiple monitors were glowing with lines of redacted documents, banking wire transfers, and classified military after-action reports. "Your judge isn't just a corrupt old boys club member, Chloe," Huck said, rubbing his tired eyes. "He's a ghost from our sandbox." Huck brought up a digitized file on the center screen. It was an incident report from October 2018, Operation Viper's Nest, Paktika Province, Afghanistan. Chloe felt a chill run down her spine. "I was there," she whispered. "I was on overwatch for that raid." "I know," Huck said softly. "That's why I dug deeper. Remember the objective? A massive cache of stolen US military weaponry. Javelins, night vision, M4s. It was supposed to be a standard seize and destroy. But it wasn't, Chloe recalled, the memory of the freezing mountain air rushing back to her. The weapons were already being loaded onto transport trucks by an unknown PMC, private military contractors. When the Ranger element pushed in, the PMC opened fire on our guys. 3 Rangers died. And the PMC escaped, Huck finished, because someone at command denied the medevac and ordered a communications blackout, claiming the airspace was compromised. It gave the contractors a 2-hour window to vanish with $50 million worth of stolen ordnance. "We never found out who the shot caller was," Chloe said, her hands balling into fists. "The op was scrubbed, classified, and buried." Huck clicked a few keys, and a massive web of offshore bank accounts appeared on the screen. The PM Marsa was a shell company funded by a defense conglomerate called Apex Logistics. Apex Logistics is quietly owned by Richard Sterling's father. Chloe's breath hitched. Richard's father stole the weapons and sold them to the highest bidder on the black market, Huck confirmed. But Richard's father isn't military. He couldn't order a comms blackout. He needed someone on the inside, a DoD liaison with access to JSOC operational command frequencies, someone who could act as a fake overlord to issue the stand-down order. Huck pulled up a heavily encrypted audio file. "I managed to unarchive the SAT phone transmission logs from that night. The signal that ordered the blackout didn't come from Bagram. It bounced off a commercial satellite and originated from a secure DoD phone in Washington, D.C. He hit play. Through the static of the recording, a panicked radio man's voice echoed, "Overlord, this is Viper 1. We are taking heavy casualties, requesting immediate air support and medevac. Over." Then a smooth, calm, older voice responded, a voice that Chloe would never forget. "Viper 1, this is Overlord Actual. Negative on air support. Airspace is compromised by hostile anti-air. Maintain position and observe radio silence. You are on your own. Out." Huck paused the recording. "I ran voice recognition algorithms against public speeches made by every DoD official active that year. It's a 99.8% match." Chloe stared at the screen, her blood turning to ice. Judge Arthur Pendleton. He was the liaison, Huck said grimly. He took a massive payout from the Sterlings to ensure those weapons got out, even if it meant letting American soldiers bleed out in the dirt. His share was funneled into an offshore account in the Caymans. 3 months later, he retired from the DoD and miraculously secured his judgeship here in Fulton County, heavily backed by Sterling campaign donations. "He sold out our guys," Chloe whispered, the sheer rage finally cracking her disciplined exterior. "He killed 3 Rangers for a paycheck, and now he's trying to take my daughter as a favor to the family that paid him off." Huck nodded slowly. "Chloe, this is treason. If you bring this to light, you'll burn Richard, his father, and the judge to the ground. But it's highly classified. You bring this into a civilian court, the feds might arrest you for violating the Espionage Act." "Let them try," Chloe had said, turning away from the monitors. "I'm a sniper, Huck. I only need 1 shot." Now, back in courtroom 4B, the silence was deafening. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like a sledgehammer. Judge Pendleton stared at Chloe, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. The bailiff, sensing the sudden, bizarre shift in the room's power dynamic, had stopped his advance. Richard Sterling frowned, looking confusedly from the judge to his ex-wife. I don't know what you are talking about," Pendleton stammered, though the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed the lie. Chloe took another step forward, her eyes pinning him to his high-backed leather chair. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. "My name is Chief Petty Officer Chloe Henderson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. 4 years ago, my call sign was Wraith Niner. I was the Overwatch sniper for Operation Viper's Nest. Pendleton flinched, as if he had been physically struck. "I was looking through a high-powered thermal scope from a ridge 2,000 yards away, Arthur," Chloe continued, her tone merciless. "I watched 3 good men die because they were denied medevac. I watched the trucks roll away. I always wondered who was on the other end of that radio." She leaned in closer, the physical embodiment of a reckoning he thought he had escaped. "Tell me, Judge," Chloe whispered, the words echoing loudly in the breathless courtroom. "Is this Overlord actual?" Panic seized Arthur Pendleton's features, twisting his arrogant sneer into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. His hand opened, and the wooden gavel clattered onto the polished mahogany desk, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor with a hollow, pathetic thud. The booming, authoritative voice that had just been lecturing Chloe about her supposed weakness vanished, replaced by a strained, wheezing gasp. For a span of 10 excruciating seconds, nobody moved. The air in courtroom 4B turned to lead. "What did you just say?" Pendleton whispered, his eyes darting frantically around the room, as if expecting the wood-panelled walls to collapse in on him. "Overlord Actual," Chloe repeated, her voice steady, cold, and entirely merciless. "That was your call sign when you used the encrypted Department of Defense SAT phone on October 14th, 2018. You ordered the communications blackout. You grounded the medevac. You gave Apex Logistics the 2-hour operational window they needed to extract the stolen weapons cache." "Objection!" David Caldwell shouted, finally finding his voice. The slick attorney sprang to his feet, his face red with indignation, though his eyes betrayed his total confusion. "Your Honor, this is unhinged. The mother is clearly suffering from a profound psychological break. She is fabricating military conspiracies in a family court. I demand she be restrained and my client be granted immediate custody." Richard Sterling, sitting beside Caldwell, wasn't yelling. He was staring at the judge. Richard was arrogant, but he wasn't stupid. He saw the color completely drained from Pendleton's face, He saw the sweat dripping down the older man's temples. "Arthur," Richard said sharply, forgetting courtroom decorum, "shut her down. Issue the ruling. Now." Pendleton opened his mouth, but only a dry croak emerged. He looked at Richard, then back to Chloe, realizing with a sickening drop in his stomach that he was trapped. Chloe turned her gaze to her ex-husband. "He can't, Richard. Because Arthur didn't just land this case by coincidence, did he? Your father pulled strings to get our divorce and custody battle assigned to Judge Pendleton. You thought it was a brilliant play. Use the man your family has been blackmailing for 4 years to ensure I got utterly destroyed in court." Richard stood up, his $5,000 suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. "You are out of your mind, Chloe. You have zero proof of any of this." "I have the offshore routing numbers," Chloe replied, taking another step toward the center of the room. She was no longer a defendant. She was an operator commanding the battlefield. "I have the wire transfers from the Cayman Island shell accounts owned by Apex Logistics, and I have the unarchived audio file of Arthur's voice denying air support to American soldiers, effectively sentencing 3 Army Rangers to death." Greg Miller, Chloe's public defender, had shrunk back into his chair, his jaw practically on the floor. He had spent his entire career pleading down misdemeanors. He was entirely unequipped for high treason revelations. "Bailiff!" Pendleton suddenly shrieked, a desperate, high-pitched sound that shattered his patrician facade. "Clear the gallery. Arrest this woman. She is threatening a federal officer. This court is in immediate recess." The bailiff hesitated, his hand hovering over his handcuffs. He looked at Chloe, who hadn't even flinched at the judge's outburst, and then at the hyperventilating judge. "You don't get to call a recess, Arthur," Chloe said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. "In sniper school, they teach us to be patient. You track your target. You learnt their habits. You wait until the wind dies down, and you wait until they are completely isolated before you squeeze the trigger." She checked her plain black tactical watch. "I didn't come here today to beg you for my daughter," Chloe continued, looking directly into Pendleton's terrified eyes. "I knew you were going to rule against me. I knew this was a kangaroo court. I just needed to keep you and Richard in this specific room, at this specific time." "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice trembling. He took a step backward, looking toward the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. "Did you really think I would walk into an ambush without backup?" Chloe asked, a ghost of a smile finally touching the corners of her mouth. "My friend Huck didn't just decrypt those files for my personal reading pleasure. 72 hours ago, he securely forwarded the entire data packet, the audio, the offshore accounts, the Apex Logistics connection, to the Department of Justice Inspector General, the FBI Counterintelligence Division, and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service." Pendleton collapsed back into his leather chair, clutching his chest. He looked like he was about to have a heart attack. "No," Pendleton wheezed. "No, it's classified. They wouldn't—" "They take treason very seriously, Arthur," Chloe said. She looked back at her watch. 3, 2, 1. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the rear of courtroom 4B blew open with a deafening crack. The bailiff jumped, reaching for his sidearm, but froze as a dozen men and women in dark suits and tactical vests flooded the aisle. They moved with the silent, terrifying efficiency of federal agents executing a high-risk warrant. Leading the pack was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a closely cropped beard. He flashed a gold shield that caught the fluorescent light. "Special Agent Thomas Kessler, Federal Bureau of Investigation," the man announced, his voice carrying the weight of the United States government. "Everyone keep your hands where I can see them. Nobody moves." The gallery erupted into gasps and murmurs but a sharp look from Kessler silenced them instantly. David Caldwell, sensing the massive legal implosion, immediately took 3 giant steps away from Richard Sterling, holding his hands up in the air. "I am just the divorce attorney," Caldwell yelped. "I have no knowledge of my client's business dealings outside of this family matter." Kessler ignored the lawyer and marched straight past the defense tables, ascending the steps to the judge's bench. "Arthur Pendleton," Kessler said, pulling a folded document from his jacket. "I have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with conspiracy, wire fraud, violation of the Espionage Act, and 3 counts of felony murder in relation to the deaths of United States military personnel in Paktika Province, Afghanistan." Pendleton didn't fight. The fight had completely drained out of him. He let out a pathetic, whimpering sob as Kessler pulled his arms behind his back and snapped cold steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sound of the ratcheting metal echoed loudly in the silent courtroom. "Take him down," Kessler ordered 2 of his agents. They hauled the former judge out of his chair, roughly patting him down before frog-marching him toward the exit. The patrician lord of Fulton County looked small, broken, and utterly pathetic. Kessler then turned his attention to the petitioner's table. Richard Sterling was frantically tapping at his cell phone, his face pale. "I need my father. I need corporate counsel. You can't do this. I'm a Sterling." "Your father was arrested at his country club 30 minutes ago, Mr. Sterling," Kessler said dryly. "And I suggest you put the phone down before I add obstruction of justice to your charges." 2 more agents flanked Richard. "Richard Sterling," Kessler read from another warrant. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit treason, money laundering, and violation of the Arms Export Control Act. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Richard looked at Chloe, his eyes wide with a mixture of hatred and absolute shock. You did this. You planned all of this." "I told you 4 years ago, Richard," Chloe said softly, walking closer to him. "You don't corner a wounded animal, and you certainly don't corner a Tier 1 operator and try to take her kid." As the agent slapped the cuffs on Richard and dragged him away, he began shouting for Caldwell, who deliberately looked at the ceiling, entirely ignoring his former Golden Goose client. Within 5 minutes, the courtroom was nearly empty, save for Chloe, her stunned lawyer Greg, Agent Kessler, and a handful of federal investigators bagging computers and files from the judge's chambers. Kessler walked over to Chloe. The hard federal agent mask slipped just a fraction, revealing a look of profound respect. "Chief Petty Officer Henderson," Kessler said, extending his hand. Chloe shook it firmly. "Agent Kessler, I assume the data packet Huck sent was sufficient." "More than sufficient," Kessler said. "We've been trying to nail Apex Logistics for black market arms dealing for a decade, but we could never find the leak inside the DoD. You handed us the smoking gun on a silver platter. The director wanted me to extend his personal gratitude. You got justice for those Rangers today." Chloe looked at the empty bench where Pendleton had sat just moments before, spewing his venom about her supposed weakness. They were good men. They didn't deserve to be sold out by a man in a comfortable suit. "What about your custody case?" Kessler asked, glancing around the chaotic room. Greg Miller finally found his voice, stepping forward, straightening his cheap tie. "Well, given that the father is currently en route to a federal holding facility on charges of treason, and the presiding judge has been arrested for the same, I think it's safe to say we'll be filing an emergency motion for full sole custody to my client." Greg paused, looking at Chloe with a newfound, slightly terrified awe, which, any new judge will grant in about 4 seconds. Chloe let out a long, slow breath. The tension that had been coiled tight in her muscles for weeks finally began to release. Her heart rate, which had stayed a steady 35 beats per minute throughout the entire ordeal, finally ticked up to a normal rhythm. She turned and walked out of the courtroom, pushing open the heavy oak doors and stepping out into the bright, sunlit hallway of the courthouse. She didn't look back. The mission was complete. The target was neutralized. An hour later, Chloe stood on the front porch of her modest suburban home. The school bus hissed to a stop at the corner of the street. A moment later, a small girl with a bright pink backpack hopped down the steps, her pigtails bouncing. "Mommy!" Lily yelled, sprinting down the sidewalk. Chloe dropped to her knees, right there on the concrete, opening her arms wide. Lily crashed into her, wrapping her small arms tightly around Chloe's neck. Chloe buried her face in her daughter's shoulder, breathing in the scent of strawberries and sunshine. "Hey, Bug," Chloe whispered, a tear finally escaping and tracking down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of weakness. It was a tear of profound, unbreakable strength. "I'm right here. Mommy's right here. And we're going to be just fine." She squeezed her daughter tighter, knowing that the shadows of her past had finally been laid to rest. The sniper had taken her final shot, and she had never missed. True strength is rarely loud or boastful. It resides in the quiet, unyielding resolve to protect what matters most. Chloe Henderson proved that the scars of battle do not make one weak, but rather forge an unbreakable resilience. In a corrupt system designed to break her, she weaponized the truth, turning her darkest memories into the ultimate shield for her daughter's future. Justice, finally, had been served.